Thank you for these prompt questions from Nadia Fairchild 9369 over on my YouTube comment section on a previous video. I'll read their question or their comment and then continue. Quote, I'm trans, not that it's important, but I just subscribed and I wanted to say that I see and appreciate your content. We need the collective experiences from people who transition and detransition to better understand the mental health dynamics at play. My questions to you are, I was wondering if you could speak toward how you have internalized your detransition. Specifically, how has detransition changed your perspective from the different periods of time throughout transition? I'm only asking because one of the hallmarks of what I would personally describe as gender dysphoria is a sense of regret that I did not experience growing up and pubescence according to my self-identity. That is to say, I grew up being androgenized and socialized as male. Now that I've transitioned, those experiences of masculinity hurt in a way that was different from when I had experienced them. They hurt retroactively as a regret and a grief. In the same vein of thought, do you experience pain, grief, or regret when you ponder the period that you were transitioning? I'm sorry if the questions are too invasive. Please disregard them if you don't want to answer. I understand. The reason I ask these questions is because a lot of stories I've personally been exposed to of detransition are used as a sort of political anecdote to prove that transition is unilaterally harmful to people. I think this mindset of politicization does a lot of harm to people who transition and or detransition. I want to understand how detransition and transition relate to each other, as most people seem to believe that the two experiences are medically, politically, and spiritually contradictory. Let me know what you think. This is actually a very good comment. Thank you for leaving this one. So, I'll open by saying that my transition and detransition have both been roughly the same, which is slow, incremental, and complicated by my personal life circumstances. But before I go further, I do need to state that I think it's inappropriate to call any of this just a gender transition or detransition. I think what's actually happened here is that I first converted as a child into an alternative cultural system from the one that I was born into, and now I've converted back into a version of that original cultural system. I'm not a male to male gender transitioner. I converted to another culture with a different worldview and different moral priorities. And then, recently, I've converted again to a new version of my original culture. The conversion is undeniable, internally and externally. I no longer believe in gender identities in any of the ways described by contemporary trans cultures. And despite this, I also don't believe that the detransitioner identity is actually a helpful identity in the long term, particularly not to the actual living human beings who deeply define themselves by it, because if and when their day-to-day life and cultural worldview shifts away from their previous trans worldview, it's not going to serve them in the same way. Now, I need to speak to some of the details and the mechanics of my cultural conversion, so please bear with me, it'll make a lot more sense by the end. Although I can't be certain of precisely when and why I first started to properly entertain the thought of detransitioning, it had been gnawing away at my conscience like a slowly rising tide over the last 3 years. Because I envision myself a scientist and a truth seeker, I feel compelled to seek out competent counter-narratives to help make sure that I'm not being misled. In at least 2018, this drive encouraged me to notice and listen to the early waves of young detransitioner narratives, the best of which came in the form of hours-long personal interviews and blog posts, rather than just snippy clickbait views or news articles. Much to my own surprise, I quickly realized I had deep sympathies for these fellow young people who'd clearly been ill-fit in their trans cultures and had been unnecessarily medicalized by those systems. I listened to hundreds of their stories over the course of 2018, ongoing to this day, but in particular to the year of 2022, and at some point I could no longer ignore the obvious parallels between my own story and theirs. While I understand that no personal story can ever match another person's one-to-one, once I began to recognize as an adult how neatly my own story best fit into a detransitioner narrative structure, it was only a matter of time, I think, before I eventually converted again into something new. And to be clear, this is the same kind of process that first convinced me to convert into a trans culture to begin with. My internal story and life experiences lined up enough with the narratives presented by trans culture, and because I was already looking to leave my birth culture out of a resentful teenage rebelliousness, where better to go than into the trans culture of which I was already largely a part of? Or rather, queer culture at large. An opportunity to rebirth myself is what it provided me. It gave me the opportunity to take on a new name, a new body, new pronouns, into a new community and a new family, a family that would accept me for me and that promises me that it will always be there to encourage me in pursuing my fondest desires. It's eerie to consider in hindsight, but for a time, it did feel like I had been born again. Now we can speak about the dysphoria angle, regret, and how it is the mind that generates both of these phenomena. As soon as I began internalizing even the potential of a new transgender identity for myself, my pre-existing gender dysphoria, or autoandrophobia, became far worse. It was catalyzed. The corresponding culture and worldview that I was converting to fueled the severity and the speed of my growing self-hatred. All of my friends and new family had no problem espousing their hatred for various types of people, including cis, heterosexual, white, male, men, in particular, all of the above at once. It was clear to me that there was nothing good to be found in what diminished and insufficient masculinity I had left in me. I already held a version of this view prior to unrestricted internet access, but I had little defense against this narrative once it became my day-to-day life, hidden away on my PC. So many things I had previously felt neutral about, or even good, turned sour as the conflict generated by my desire to embody an idealized womanhood grew larger and larger. There is a Buddhist teaching which explains that desire is the root of all suffering and stress. In the West, I believe this is to be known as dysphoria. This basic premise explains that as soon as you desire for something to be different, your body generates a feeling from the comparison. The intensity is gauged by the perceived distance between where you are now and where it is that you now desire to be. It's observed that the same suffering will also worsen if you perceive yourself as moving away from your proposed state of difference. Now, neurologically speaking, the inverse phenomena is equally true of emotional happiness. As soon as you have a positive vision in mind for how things could be different, a desire, your body will reactively produce a dopamine response and make you feel happier when you perceive yourself as moving toward that idealized state of difference. When I had adopted the cultural construct of my transgender identity, I came to loathe almost every inch of my past as a male. Using the desire itself as motivation, I had been coached to create a kindly inquisitor inside my own mind. Now, weaponized against my previous self, I set out to struggle over each and every fact and moment in order to free myself from the guilt and shame of my male history. First and foremost, I hated my family, father, sister, mother, and more. Through the lens of my new worldview, their existence had been reframed from a source of potential support and comfort to a merely painful reminder that I will always be a male, specifically an insufficient man and a misunderstood boy. I couldn't ignore my lingering connections to my family. I despised them because they were reminders of who I was before and who I still was underneath. They knew the whole me, and at the time, that knowledge felt like a prison. I was convinced. I had to hate them, because that gave me justification to cut them out of my life. I had to remove everything and everyone from before, out of sight, out of mind. I had to totally free myself of any remaining connection to that past self. Only then could I fully embody that idealized woman I desired to be. Or at least, that's how it felt at the time. The drama and the irony of my past self is not lost on me nowadays. But the humour of my retrospective teenage angst is bittersweet when I pay attention to just how many vital years of life and opportunity that I'll just never get to do again. Time spent wallowing in self-righteous and self-referential victimhood complexes, chasing short-sighted happiness. It's this loss of every human being's most fundamental resource that feels so harmful to me now. I barely even think about the other consequences of my transition and medicalization, including an amount of stunted brain development or brain damage, kidney/pancreas/liver disease, autoimmune complications, uniquely elevated cancer risks, and other lingering digestive concerns. But no, none of that really feels quite as bad to me as all the real moments of my life potential that I can never recover. Thinking of the relationships that I could have had, or how much deeper they could already be, the skills that I never learned because I was too busy rotting away in my bedroom through a fantasy life, so much opportunity to live that I opted out of because, again, I was too busy waiting, or essentially praying for my next life to begin, the life as that idealized woman that would never come. This is what gives me the most dysphoria as a detransitioner. But before we get too sad about this, I want us to remember what I said before. It is still desire that is the root of all suffering. For the questions I opened this video with, they were completely spot on in noticing the parallels between a detransitioner and a transitioner narrative. Although greatly different in the cultures that encourage these worldviews, both narratives begin by creating an idealized and impossible sense of a potential self that ought to take priority in an individual's motivations. For a male transitioner like me, the narrative generally posits a vision of romanticized womanhood, free from the demonized elements of manhood. Then, for a male detransitioner like me, the opposing narrative posits a vision of unmedicalized bodily health and highlights the potential perfection lost in one's years struggling through the lens of an unnecessary social construct. Notice that both of these individualistically obsessed ideals are definitionally impossible to achieve. First, I will never truly escape the reality of my male body. And second, I will never undo my time living as a member of a trans culture either. A transitioner and detransitioner narrative, once internalized, both become capable of generating infinite dysphoria for the individual, precisely because they can never be completely embodied, let alone in a completely reliable and sustainable way. That is just how reality is for human beings at this point in history. As far as I understand, we do not have the ability to change sex. Gender appears to be a combination of unique individual biology mixed with cultural circumstances. There is no feminine or masculine essence to be found in a person, no separate mental self, no duality. We are our bodies, and that's enough for me. Perhaps these facts could be different in the future. We could discover more, invent new technologies, whatever it takes. For now, though, in order to open myself back up to pursuing life worth living, I must accept the reality of what is. I had to let go of my ever-shifting and impossible desire of what should be so that I could heal mentally and spiritually and appreciate what is. Only by weakening my focus on that ideal gendered self, my dysphoria began to actually improve. And while the full weight of my gender dysphoria has lightened so much from that one fundamental realization, please consider that it's never enough to just remove a core motivation. You must replace it with something else. The opposite of addiction, or unquenching desire, is not abstinence, it's integration. I want to assure you that our natural drives are not gifts or curses. They are just evolutionary tools. It is up to us what we use these tools to do, and I believe we are responsible for finding good uses for them. This has been a bit of a strange ride for me to write, and possibly to read, but please stay with me for one more moment to round this out. It would be irresponsible of me to say that I don't regret so many of the choices that I've made in my life, or that I don't feel any pangs of guilt and shame or otherwise when I consider my part in perpetuating the worldview of self-defeat. But personally, I am lucky enough to have avoided most major medical complications, and although I did pursue surgery twice, neither of them actually resulted in going under the knife. What I'm trying to say is that, in spite of this all, I think I'm just really grateful to be alive, here and now, as things as they are. I still have the support of my family and my friends, old and new, despite what I put them through. I still have the love of my amazing spouse, who is still a trans man, and who has endured with me through the waves of my cultural reconversion. I have undergone fertility testing along with my spouse, as we intend to start creating our own biological children as soon as possible. And despite everything, I still have all these real people and the rest of the years of my life waiting to be lived. I am not at the end of my life as much as it can feel like that at times. Not by a long shot. I'm at the start. That narrative is in my control. Funny how that works when you convert to a different culture. That feeling of renewal, strength, vigor, of fresh opportunities and boundless hope. That, blessed be we, given the chance to be born again. Thank you for coming to this video. I hope to put out another one by the end of next week. Please leave me any comments, any questions that you might have that I could go into in regarding to my situation, or anything you'd just like to hear my opinion on. Thank you, and goodbye.